Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. What a wonderful treat we have today to have our friend Jane Hirshfield join us. I know a lot of you on the screen and a lot I don't. My name's Geoff O'Keefe. I will change my name so that you can see that. But my name's Geoff O'Keefe. I'm the executive director of Zen Peacemakers. And this program today is part of our Peacemaker Circle practice. Every week we have we try to get together like this with a guest that can speak to the various topics that are in the around the mandala, around the circle of our focus areas for Zen Peacemakers. So Jane Hirshfield could not be more aligned with that, which is wonderful. For those who don't know, and I can't imagine that there's a person on the call who doesn't, but Jane's a poet and an essayist, a translator, has held positions in academia, has more awards and honorifics than I think it would take 15 minutes for me to list them. So I won't do that. I'll let you read them on the website. And the last I looked, Jane has, and you can correct me, Jane, 10 collections of poems, and I'm not sure that includes the newest one, but I'm going to do a shameless plug. This is, I don't think you'll object. This is Jane's newest book, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. It's as we were just chatting about, it's really a compilation of a life's work. There are poems from all of her collections, I think all of them, going back, I think the earliest maybe 1971, up through new poems that have not been published elsewhere. And I couldn't recommend it more. And especially if you're not, I have, a couple of other of Jane's books on the shelf. Especially if you're not familiar, this is a wonderful place to start because you can really see her work over time. Rosanna Warren said of Jane's work, Hirshfield has elaborated a sensuously philosophical art that imposes a pause in our fast-forward habits of mind, which I think is an extraordinary quote. The pause is not in our busy schedules or our jobs and all that stuff. It's in what our mind does. And I thought that was just brilliantly insightful. And from having spent a lot of hours in the last week or so reading Jane's poems, I can attest to that. We were chatting just a little bit earlier, and I said I wasn't going to make this comparison, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. I had this feeling yesterday when I was reading some of these poems. I really got the feeling of reading the Mumonkan or working. You don't read the Mumonkan per se, or the Blue Cliff Record or the Book of Equanimity. These collections of koans, you don't sit down and read them 100 pages at a time. Some of them take years to work through, and the poems on these pages in Jane's book really strike me that way, and they really call me to stillness and call me to releasing my hold on things in order to participate in the poem. So, but you didn't come here to listen to me, so I'm going to pass over. The title today of what we're doing is, which couldn't be more perfect. Everything changes. Everything is connected. Pay attention. Pay attention. It's a complete teaching. I mean, there it all is. We're done. So, Jane, I'm going to hand it to you, and then we'll have a little fun.
Well, thank you so much. So that was a marvelous introduction, and your comment was perfect because, in fact, the origin of that phrase was I was on the phone with someone, I won't name them, and they had been offered a book contract to write a book about all of Buddhism. And what they said to me on the phone was, but they only gave me 40,000 words. And I said, 40,000 words? Oh, that's either way too many or way too few. And they said, way too many. And I said, well, you only need 7. Now, I had never thought about this before, so I have no idea why that sentence came out of my mouth. And then he said, what are they? And I said, everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention. So I was lucky it came out to 7 because I didn't even have time to be thinking and counting. But it does seem to me, so that phrase for me is, all Buddhism in 7 words, I call it. And there are many things missing, but they can be, as you so wonderfully just, said yourself, they can all be unfolded from those words. And so, the word compassion is not in the 7, but everything is connected, is the source of our compassion. The non-separation of self and other is part of that. And, some years after all of this, so some students of mine, when I was teaching a workshop at Tassajara, they made a little T-shirt with the 7 words on it. And for a while, it was my very most quoted thing I'd ever said. It flew around wildly. It's inscribed on a sculpture bench by one of the Great Lakes. And it took me several years before I realized you only need 2. Pay attention. Because if you just pay attention, everything else reveals itself, So really, you only need 2, but it's a little less catchy than the 7. So I'm very grateful to be here with you and with everyone, to have a conversation that puts the poems into an explicit context of Dharma things and practice is something that I have always hoped they do not need. I've never labeled myself a Buddhist poet or a Zen poet because I felt like that might put up a barrier between the poems and people whose ideas about Buddhism or Zen are, either totally inaccurate or not very deep, or they just think, oh, well, that's not for me. I have always just tried to write the poems of being a human being. But as a human being, I spent my 20s in full-time formal training. I spent 3 years at the wilderness monastery at Tassajara. And of course, that is in the work. Just as, of course, all the teachings of the Dharma are in being a human being if you simply pay attention to what happens in our lives. So maybe that's enough of an introduction. What should we talk about?
Well, good question. And we were, as I mentioned, we were talking before we began, and Jane and I had a conversation. I don't know what it was, a month ago, 2 months ago, something, and we came up with kind of a scheme or a structure to discuss her poems that had that was built around sort of themes that were loosely related to the Three Tenets. And I'm pretty sure that Jane came up with these, and she's pretty sure that I came up with them. So, a couple of baby boomers trying to remember, where we left the car keys, but it'll work out. So, let's do this. And Jane doesn't know what poems I picked, so this will be a little bit of a, maybe a surprise to some extent. The first theme was questioning, which is fundamental in Zen practice. It's what we do. And that's related to not knowing, the first tenet, of course. And Jane, I pulled one, and I'll be interested to see if you think this is apt, from your newer collection, Counting, New Year's Morning, What Powers Yet Remain to Me. It's on page 4 of your book.
Thank you. Well, that is certainly the perfect place to start a conversation about questioning and about this book, because the book takes its title from the poem's last words. And the poem is very much an act of relationship to questions. So every New Year's morning, I try to start the year writing a poem, so that it's very hard because you can only do one thing first. And for many years I sat zazen first thing New Year's morning. Well, now I start the year writing a poem, which is not so different than zazen in that it is an act of permeability and concentration and openness to what is, in which you try to have the narrow self step out of the way of the large and the connected. I also do the Japanese traditional New Year's Eve house cleaning, except as I've gotten older, it now takes weeks. It used to be one very long day, but every single thing in the house gets cleaned, every ledge, every top of a light bulb, everything. So that's in the poem. The other thing that's in the poem, which I think nothing in the poem tells you that this is what is behind this, but this poem was written New Year's Day 2021. And you all might remember that time. The election was over. We knew we would have a new administration, but January 6th had not happened yet. And one could feel all was not yet right with the world, or I don't know, bad language, sorry. But you felt a certain uneasiness. I had been for 5 years taking some political action every day of my life, whether it was consequential or inconsequential didn't matter. What mattered was that I did something every day. And I had finally arrived on something I'm now back to doing every day again, writing postcards. So, now the postcards are to unregistered potential voters in swing states who, with a couple of words, suggesting why registering as a Democrat might be a good idea. But, the postcards went everywhere, but that's the postcards in here. Okay, enough preface. Here is the poem. Counting New Year's morning, what powers yet remain to me? The world asks, as it asks daily, and what can you make, can you do to change my deep broken, fractured? I count this first day of another year, what remains. I have a mountain, a kitchen, 2 hands. Can admire with 2 eyes the mountain, actual, recalcitrant, shuffling its pebbles, sheltering foxes and beetles. Can make black-eyed peas and collards, can make from last year's late ripening persimmons a pudding, can climb a stepladder, change the bulb in a track light. For years, I woke each day first to the mountain, then to the question. The feet of the new sufferings followed the feet of the old, and still they surprised. I brought salt, brought oil to the question, brought sweet tea, brought postcards and stamps, for years each day something. Stone did not become apple. War did not become peace. Yet joy still stays joy. Sequins stay sequins, words still bespangle, bewilder. Today I woke without answer. The day answers, unpockets a thought as though from a friend. Don't despair of this falling world. Not yet. Didn't it give you the asking?
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
So yeah, that has, questioning and not knowing. The not knowing was very literal. I started the poem that morning, but I didn't finish it for, 2 or 3 weeks because I actually didn't know what the answer was going to be to this world's question, and what can you do to change my deep, broken, fractured? This is an unanswerable question. And what finally came as answer was a question, which is so often how practice proceeds, I think.
Keeps us moving forward, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Don't despair of this falling world. I had a recollection. One of my favorite poems is Philip Whalen's Hymnus ad Patrum Sinensis.
Oh,
And
yes, marvelous.
it reminded me of that, of this world and 100 others before them, gone to hell in a handbasket, as we lay among the broken wine jars, happy to have saved I forget the exact words, but it's like that.
So Philip was my head monk when I was at Tassajara
Oh, no kidding. Oh, okay.
period. Yeah, it was, and he was extraordinary. He was just extraordinary. Yeah.
And this is such a nice book. I hate to mark in it, but I just gave myself permission to mark all over this book. So I hope that feels good. And as you read, I marked the feet of the new sufferings followed the feet of the old, and still they surprised. Yeah.
So you want me to say something about that, or?
I was just struck by it because in that line, we don't get freed from those sufferings. We
Right.
move from the old ones to the new ones.
Right. And surprise is really interesting. I've thought a lot about surprise in a number of different ways. I've written in the second book of essays, 10 Windows, there's a whole chapter on, it's called Poetry in the Constellation of Surprise. And I don't think I put this in that chapter, but probably a lot of people on this Zoom are familiar with the neuroscience study of putting people, where they could look at their brain waves and just ringing a bell every so often. And normal people, eventually they stop hearing the bell. They acclimate to it, and the brain just doesn't register anything when it rings again. But when they put meditating monks in the study, they heard the bell every time. And, this is, I think, a relationship to, or a comment on the beginner's mind of contemplative awareness, that you don't acclimate. I am shocked every single time I face, not only the world suffering, but that some people are actually choosing to perpetuate it. I just never get over the surprise of it.
Yeah.
I don't get used to it. And I wonder, is this naivete or is it practice? Who knows? But it is my experience, the continual shock. And then because I am so shocked and because I am so saddened, having to face it over and over again. And a lot of that facing happens for me in poems. Poems are how I find a way to not despair, to feel the sharpness of my perplexity and disappointment and grief, and to feel the sharpness of the world's sufferings, but not give up. Each poem that is written in that particular terrain is a refinding of a way to keep the heart and the hope of practice mind awake and alive, to open your eyes to the next day, which human beings do need to do.
you know, getting used to those horrors would mean that we're, just my perspective, but it seems like it would mean that we're settling into habit
Yes.
rather than being awake,
Yeah.
rather than that each one of those is a Dharma gate, as we might say, and
Yes.
each ring of that bell is the Dharma gate, and so uh, it should be new each time, even if it's horrible, even if it's horrible. Yeah. Well, we let's if we can, let's step into our next subheading. Maybe the, you know, these are with lowercase letters, of course, but the next one we talked about was be still, which is really part of, if not all of, the first tenet of not knowing. And tell me what, I don't know if I mentioned this one. I picked After Long Silence. It's on 185.
Okay.
And in fact, all of your poems could be still.
Yeah, yeah. There's one I'll slip in fast because it's very short. We'll see if I can do it from memory. I have the world's worst memory, lifelong. It's not age. I sat in the sun. I sat in the sun. I moved my chair into sun. I sat in the sun the way hunger is moved when called fasting. Something like that.
I like it.
Yeah. So here's After Long Silence. Politeness fades. A small anchovy gleam leaving the upturned pot and the dish rack after the moon has wandered out of the window. One of the late freedoms there in the dark. The leftover soup put away as well. Distinctions matter. Whether a goat's quiet face should be called noble or indifferent. The difference between a right rigor and pride. The untranslatable thought must be the most precise. Yet words are not the end of thought. They are where it begins.
Yes, I very much like this one. And I marked in my book, the untranslatable thought must be the most precise.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's precious. I really love that. The next and we don't want to be too strict about the structure, but the next tenet is bearing witness, and so our the next topical heading is bearing witness. But what I wrote in my notes was look, and what one of the ways that we express this is, you know, regard the joys and the pain, the suffering, the beauty and the horror of the universe, and don't turn away. Don't turn away.
Yeah.
And I have picked one, but Jane and I were talking a little bit earlier, and there's one that I had in a different category that she thought was best under this heading. This is a day beginning with seeing the International Space Station and a full moon over the Gulf of Mexico and all its invisible fishes.
Thank you. Yeah. So this bears witness to a lot, this poem. It bears witness to everything from, you know, the asteroid hitting the Earth and taking out the dinosaurs, to the geomorphology of how the land in Florida was made. The civil war in Syria is in it. In a very oblique way, not named. The Boston Marathon terrorist act is in it. And it ends with something that had been going on for years when I wrote this poem, and is still going on now. And it has been years since I wrote this poem, which is the crisis of the refugees in the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of witness bearing in it. I can't remember which section did you have it under? Which
I had originally put it under fail.
Oh, yeah, right. because it is, of course, the world's failures that, for example, for all these years, people have been lost in the Mediterranean Sea because we cannot resolve the suffering behind it and within it. Okay, so I will say the long title again and then read the poem. Day beginning with seeing the International Space Station and a full moon over the Gulf of Mexico and all its invisible fishes. None of this had to happen. Not Florida, not the ibis's beak, not water, not the horseshoe crab's empty body, and not the living starfish. Evolution might have turned left at the corner and gone down another street entirely. The asteroid might have missed. The seams of limestone need not have been susceptible to sand and mangroves. The radio might have found a different music. The hips of one man and the hips of another might have stood beside each other on a bus in Aleppo and recognized themselves as long-lost brothers. The key could have broken off in the lock, and the nail can refused its lid. I might have been the fish the brown pelican swallowed. You might have been the way the moon kept not setting, long after we thought it would, long after the sun was catching inside the low wave curls coming in at a certain angle. The light might not have been eaten again by its moving. If the unbearable were not weightless, we might yet buckle under the grief of what hasn't changed yet. Across the world, a man pulls a woman from the water from which the leapt from overfilled boat has entirely vanished. From the water pulls one child, another. Both are living, and both will continue to live. This did not have to happen. No part of this had to happen. Well, I was in Syria before the civil war, but while this country was bombing Iraq, which if you drive between Aleppo and Damascus on the main road, there's a highway sign that looks exactly like the sign if you were driving from San Francisco to Los Angeles and there were a highway sign for Sacramento. But the highway sign was, take this exit and go to Baghdad. And I was so aware that it might as well have read, take this exit and go to hell. So much suffering. And I was with a little group of American writers, and we were traveling, speaking to many different people, various dignitaries, also university students. That was 2008. When the Civil War broke out, not too long after that, I was and continue to be haunted by the thought of those students who we spoke with. Where are they? Which side did they end up on? Are they now in a refugee camp with children? Are they alive?
Yeah.
Just absolutely haunted by them.
I don't know what to say about that. Well, it's just, it's, and maybe that's the right response.
Well, as practice people, this is my take one action every day, whether it has any consequence or not, whether it is foolish and empty. I don't know how, just like in the first poem, stone did not become apple, war did not become peace. And yet, here we are, Zen peacemakers hoping that by what we do, something will ripple out into the world. Not only, we're not just here to find our own peace. We are here, within the Bodhisattva vow to save all beings. I suppose I'm jumping ahead on your themes. I'm sorry.
No,
Talking
you're doing,
about, taking action.
no,
But
you're doing fine.
yeah, sometimes, so bearing witness is taking action. Feeling the suffering of others as one's own is a kind of action. Writing a poem is a kind of action. And, I don't know if anyone who doesn't already agree with the worldview of my poems would ever read one and be altered by it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I do have this strong feeling that culture is contagious, and that, if a person meets a person who looks at them with compassion for half a moment on the street, their day might be changed, their behavior might be changed. Similarly, if a person meets with somebody for half a moment on the street who looks at them and reels backwards, their day will be changed. What they do will be changed. And so we try to live within, the precepts and the paramitas and the requests to be permeable to one another, and the request for some fundamental sense of wishing others well.
Mm-hmm.
That it's so simple. And yet it is all I know how to do. Yes, I have, when our generation, your and my generation, the foundational act of that era was, to sit on the Washington Mall with hundreds and thousands of other people protesting the Vietnam War.
Yes, that's
Or
right.
the week that, all of us were fasting because Cambodia was being bombed, and taking the money we weren't spending on food for a week and donating it to feed others, to help others, to do the work of peace. And, this baton of large outward action keeps moving from this instance to the next instance to the next instance. A lot of my current work has to do with the crisis of the biosphere and of climate and of science. That is where a great deal of my work has moved to in the most recent years. And, that's a whole other thread that we can get to if you want to.
Yes.
But just to do something, to do anything. Yeah.
Well, I think it challenges folks sometimes, three tenet practice, because the question inevitably comes up if people are just newly exposed to it. Well, so what are you actually going to do to make the world a better place? And I love what you just said, because merely the act of witnessing, of paying attention, is transformative.
Yes.
It's subtle, and it may not be evident all the time, and it may not even evidence itself for a while, maybe years.
Yes.
Parents know this about their kids. The things that, oh my Lord, what I did when they were 4 years old, and now they're doing it. So, but that goes both ways. That could be the good influences, of course, as well. So, yeah, and that taking action part, which we're going to get to here in a minute, the action might be doing nothing. Actually.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean be in the street.
Can I say something about that, because it is so close to my heart?
Please.
So it feels to me, just as, you can't be a poet if you don't love silence. You can't take an action that will be, what in the language of the precepts and paramitas would be, right action, if you aren't capable of taking no action. The ability to sit in non-action is what allows time and intention and vow to enter into that first impulse, which might not be coming from large mind.
Right.
And there is no better way to do harm than to believe with absolute certainty. This goes back to not knowing also. People who are sure they are right do the most damage in the world because they think you can do anything in the service of what you believe is right. And if you don't know, and if you have doubt, and if you abide in your uncertainty, that might stop you from taking that any means in the service of the end, very not right action. I learned so much, those 3 years, especially in the monastery, sitting on the zafu, no matter what came through, whether it was physical pain or emotional discomfort or exhaustion, learning that you can just stay on the zafu and eventually something will change. That is one of the great, deep aquifer resources of my life. Having learned that lesson over and over and over again, because when you're on the zafu, you won't do anything that will cause karma. You won't, if you're angry, you won't say anything hurtful to someone else.
That's right. Yeah.
If you're, in despair, you won't do anything hurtful towards yourself. You just stay on the zafu. So it is the resource that underlies, I think, action, which comes from, everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention, rather than the impulse to, oh my God, I've just been insulted, I must strike back.
Yeah. Yeah. That reactivity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, I don't want to take up much time, but you've stimulated me to share something. I'm starting to write a short essay called a Confession, and it's stimulated by watching young people who were my age 50 years ago plus at Columbia and NYU and Washington University and elsewhere, Berkeley, and realizing what I did 50, 52, 54 years ago, and recalling it very, very specifically, May 9th, 1972, the mining of Haiphong Harbor. And we all came out. I was at Washington State University, and we shut down the university, which happened a lot then.
Yes.
And I had a real experience remembering that one of the many times I was in Vietnam more recently, of just looking at people and kind of having that connection. But after that, the image that I had from that memory was of the young woman with her 2 kids in the car who needed to drop them off at daycare to get to her university job. And I sat in the road and didn't allow her to do that. And it broke my heart. Oh, and so related to what you're talking about, sometimes our actions, they might feel righteous. It sure felt good to me at the time. And I've carried that around for almost 50 years, how righteous all of that activity was. It might have simply been reactive. It might have simply been, I'm so upset by what's happening in Vietnam, which is a legitimate feeling. but I can't hold it. I don't know what to do with this other than to shout and to break stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. I think it is one of the great koans of the age. And after all, we still so far live in a country where we can protest. And, even if we go to jail for protesting, it won't be too hard or too long. So we have this range of possible ways to try to move the culture in ways large and small. And I too have, I have looked at the young people now and wondered, well, if I were a college student now, would I be in a tent on Sproul Plaza,
Right.
at Berkeley? Or would I don't think even, the story you told is very poignant, because I don't think even back then I would have shut the Golden Gate Bridge, as people did quite recently, or shut the Bay Bridge, when, as the prime story about the Bay Bridge closure was there were transplant organs that couldn't get through.
Right.
So it was stopped. But we do understand the impulse. And then the question, I think, the koan is, what are the alternatives which feel effective? And of course, the one I've arrived at is I send postcards trying to get voters to register, because I think the most effective thing we can do is first this next election.
Yes.
That is the effective thing. And so that is where my one action a day goes now.
It's our innate superpower.
Yeah.
In a democracy. Yes.
But it's not so demonstrative, and your friends can't necessarily see you doing it. Although every poetry reading I give, every public event that I do, I talk about this, and I can always see, because I generally am reading that poem, Counting New Year's Morning, and so I explain about the postcards, and I often see, one or two faces. You can just see them going, I could do that. And so, that is part of it, is just, what can we do that is actually effective and causes no harm? This is the koan of the Sangha when it comes to engaged action. Yeah. So let's get to another poem. What else do you have on your list?
Yes. The one I actually chose under this bearing witness category, or the look and don't turn away, is Let Them Not Say. It's on 291.
Yeah.
I don't know if that works for you or not.
That works entirely for me. Yeah. This was a poem that, having written it, it changed my life. I had to live up to it. And I wrote it years before I published it, because I felt like it had some work to do in the world. And I held it until there was a chance for it to do it. I just never sent it out until the opportunity came for it to do its work. So the poem is looking at us from the point of view of the future. It is thinking about people in the future, thinking about us. And you don't have to read it that way. You can read it as present tense, but what I had in mind was 150 years from now, if there is anyone alive to read poems, they will know how we got through this pivot point of, I had the crisis of climate and biosphere in mind when I wrote it. But it went on to do some other work. So here's the poem. Let them not say. Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty. It burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. So as I said, I wrote that with the crisis of the biosphere and climate in mind. The kerosene beauty goes to, back in my years at Tassajara, this was before there were solar panels. We had no electricity. We lived by kerosene light. So I've burned a great deal of kerosene light and was warmed by it because the cabins were unheated. And if you lit six of them, and it was 37 degrees out, your cabin warmed up after an hour or so. But this poem hopes to make itself unneeded and incomprehensible in the future. That if in fact we do enough, people 100 years from now will say, oh, what was she so worried about? What was she so worried about? The poem wants to write itself out of being meaningful.
I like that.
It's a spell against its own existence in a way. But anyhow, I held the poem. It changed me. Having written it, I had been, engaged and an activist to some degree all my life. After writing this, I became more of one. I felt like I had to live up to its own imperative. So I held it, and then finally I was asked by the Academy of American Poets that I had been, a chancellor for, if I had a poem for New Year's Day, 2016. I think it's 2016, 2017. Anyhow, I'm just like Joe Biden. I get my years mixed up. But my heart is pure, or my heart is trying to be pure. Anyhow, they asked if I had a poem for New Year's Day, and I wrote them back and I said, well, I don't think I have a New Year's Day poem for you, but I have a poem that I feel would be awfully good to run on the day of Trump's inauguration. And I don't know if you would agree with that, but here's the poem. You let me know what you think. They have, a whole staff of younger people with, sharp sensibilities. And, half an hour later, they wrote me back and said, absolutely.
Wonderful.
So they put this up the day that Trump was inaugurated. And I was told later it went more viral than any poem a day they had ever until then put up, by multiples. So it was published as a political poem. It was published as a poem of political action. We saw, we heard, we tried, we spoke, we didn't do enough. And then it has returned to being a poem about the biosphere more recently. So it's become almost, in a small way, a kind of anthem for the climate movement. Right now, there is, at the Asia Society in New York, is the current installation of an ongoing climate project that Orville Schell inaugurated called Coal and Ice. Photographs of coal mining and of shrinking ice all over the world. This has been circulating around the world. It's been up in Beijing and Paris for a decade or more now. And they added this poem. It's the only such thing in the exhibit. So now there is a wall with this poem being projected onto it, as part of the Coal and Ice exhibit. And it's been set to music by several different composers and
wonderful.
played, like in churches on Earth Day. So the poem has it did find its work. It found its way to work, and it also found its way to work on me, in that it changed me into, this was the opening poem of the last book, Ledger, which was published in 2020. This was written in 2014. And it opens that book, and that book has more poems of engaged witness and engaged action, just as a proportion of what is in it, because I had written this.
Uh,
at the beginning of the time period held in that book.
Jane, am I hearing a vow in here also?
Oh, yes.
At the end, I'm feeling, of, sort of let them not say, yes, we did these things, but even just in a kerosene beauty,
Yeah.
I'm just the stillness of that, and I'm hearing and feeling a vow.
Thank you. You are a very fine reader to not only feel it, but be able to name it and say it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The intentions of praise. That is a vow that I had to make. Again, it is one of the curatives to paralysis and despair, is the vow to recognize that the beauty is there amidst the darkness. And that if we can find the slightest glimmer of it, we will remain in love with the world. And
Yes.
that, of course, is the Bodhisattva's vow. You cannot have a wish for all beings' well-being if you are not in love with the world.
Well, and then there's, those two words that you put next to each other, which you would not normally juxtapose, kerosene and beauty. That's,
Yeah.
one would not think of kerosene as being beautiful.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And, for those who don't know about, that I lived with kerosene lamps, I have no idea, what it means to other people, but it does seem to mean something to other people because they notice it. I've been reading the poem, a lot as I've been giving readings from this new big book. And I loved, one woman came up to me after a reading and she said, "Oh, I didn't think it was either about the climate or the biosphere. I thought it was about something else entirely." And I said, well, I suppose that makes it's an all-purpose crisis poem. Whatever crisis you might need it for, here it is.
One size fits all.
Yeah.
Well, I lived on Donner Summit in the 70s, so I know about kerosene lamps. So
Yes, yes. Oh, how marvelous you were up in that granite country.
yeah,
That's
it was beautiful.
fantastic.
Our next category, and I'm hoping you might have one or two more to add to this. We were talking about taking action. The words that I wrote down when we met and I made notes, was step forward, which I really like as a another way to express taking action. What are you going to do? What are you going to
Yeah.
do? And I don't know why this struck me, but I picked like others on 317.
Oh, bless your heart. I love that poem, and I've never been sure that other people actually care about it at all. Um, Interesting that it's yeah, oh yeah. See, this is what you said at the beginning. Maybe I'll surprise Jane with some of my choices. And you are regularly surprising me by picking this to speak to this subject. Okay. Like others. In the end, I was like others, a person, sometimes embarrassed, sometimes afraid. When fire was shouted, some ran toward it, some away. I neck deep among them. So, the main story of this poem is simply that, sometimes I've run away from the fire, but sometimes I have run toward it. And this is in one sense, again, it's not needed for the poem, but one of the reasons that we, do poetry readings and have conversations and things is people get to hear the gossip behind the poem.
Sure,
And
yeah.
so when I lived at Tassajara was the first time that the monastery was surrounded by a forest fire. The Ventana Cone fire that happened in 1977 was at that time, it's long been surpassed, but at that time it was the largest fire California had ever seen. And I was one of the very small group that ended up going back in and being there to save the buildings. There was a much more dramatic reoccurrence in 2008, which is the story is held in the book Fire Monks. There were only 5 people then.
Yeah.
With my generation of saving Tassajara from a forest fire, there were 14 practitioners and 3 Forest Service people helping. So we set back, we cut fire line, we cleaned we did all the actions. And then just as the fire was approaching, you set a backfire, and that was what saved the buildings. But I would not have known in advance that I was a person who, given the last second chance to go back in and fight a forest fire, that I would race to the car. But there are other things I have ran away from.
Well, that, when we talk about this third tenet of taking action, we always include, it might, as I said earlier, it might mean also doing nothing.
Right.
And you really speak to that in these last few lines. When fire was shouted, some ran toward it, some ran away. And then your last line doesn't help us with which one of those groups you were in. I neck deep among them. Neck deep is total immersion, completely committed, all in.
Yes.
Everything's burned up, to use your fire. But with which group?
Both.
Both and all,
Groups.
right.
Absolutely, because I am like others. Because I am like all other human beings. I am in both groups.
Yes. Sometimes we're hesitant, sometimes we're heroic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What else did you have picked out for this category of stepping?
Jane, I didn't, and I'm wondering maybe if you have one.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are lots, and I.
Okay, I'm going to give, can I do 2? And
Of
then
course.
I know at some point we want to move to letting other people ask questions. But I'm going to give, so this just seems so relevant to even though, everybody keeps saying COVID is over. I don't feel it's all that over. I still, if I'm on an airplane, I'm in a mask. If I'm in a crowded room, not giving a reading, I'm in a mask. I'm still being extremely careful about all this. But this is a poem that was written. So Ledger, that book full of engaged work, its pub date was March 10th, 2020. March 10th, 2020 was the day America realized that this was going to be serious. So it was the day that I gave a poetry reading in New York City at the 92nd Street Y to a packed auditorium on March 9th. On March 10th, I gave a reading at the Poetry Foundation in Chicago to a packed auditorium. March 11th, I gave a reading in Seattle to a room with a very few people with their chairs spread apart from each other and all of us sanitizing like mad. And March 12th, I would have given the first reading locally here in the Bay Area, and it was canceled, and everything afterwards was canceled. So since I was coming home from Seattle, which was the place that was then where COVID was known to be, as opposed to everywhere else where it actually was, I basically bought some groceries and put myself into quarantine because I felt like if anyone had been exposed, I had a good chance of having been exposed. And then a few days later, the Bay Area, some of you might remember, was the first place where shelter in place began. It was the first place where 5 counties put themselves into sequestration. So I woke up the morning of March 17th to a changed world. I was still doing things around the book. I was doing radio programs and, I was still very busy. But I woke up March 17th and the world was silent in a way that the only comparison I have is after 9/11, when everything stopped. Airplanes stopped. Engines stopped, work stopped. No one was doing carpentry within earshot, nobody. And March 17th was like that. And I stopped and listened and sort of took in this great silence which had arrived and noticed an ant. You know, I was sitting on my window seat and I noticed an ant. And so this is the poem that then came. Today, when I could do nothing. Today, when I could do nothing, I saved an ant. It must have come in with the morning paper, still being delivered to those who shelter in place. A morning paper is still an essential service. I am not an essential service. I have coffee and books, time, a garden, silence enough to fill cisterns. It must have first walked the morning paper as if loosened ink taking the shape of an ant. Then across the laptop computer, warm, then onto the back of a cushion. Small black ant, alone, crossing a navy cushion, moving steadily because that is what it could do. Set outside in the sun, it could not have found again its nest. What then did I save? It did not look as if it was frightened, even while walking my hand, which moved it through swiftness and air. Ant, alone, without companions, whose ant heart I could not fathom. How is your life? I wanted to ask. I lifted it, took it outside. This first day when I could do nothing, contribute nothing beyond staying distant from my own kind, I did this. So, you know, you can always do something, I suppose. And I did put the ant out. And as everyone realized, you know, and I did stay distant from my own kind, which was doing a great deal. That was what we were all being asked to do. And so that afternoon, I got an email from the then culture page editor of the San Francisco Chronicle saying, you know, Jane, our readers value you so much. I wonder if you might have something you could contribute to our current situation. And if I hadn't already written this, I would have declined because I can't write things fast on commission. It's not a gift of mine. But I had written this. So I said, oh, I might have something for you. Give me overnight to look it over. And you know, do some revisions if I want to. And so I gave him the poem. It was published a couple days later. It was probably in America the first pandemic poem to go viral. There were many, many, many later on, but this one was early. And the poem ended up helping people. So you think you're doing nothing. And I got an email from an entomologist who somehow figured out how to reach me. And she said, oh, don't worry, ants have very, very good pheromone sense. If it was anywhere near its nest, it made it home.
Oh, that's
So
comforting.
maybe I even did save the ant, who knows? So
Jane,
I love getting
is
that.
that poem in the asking, or is that
Yes,
in?
that's in the asking. It's one of the new ones in there. It's in the first section.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And then I want to give you a short earlier poem about stepping forward, which again, it has to do with this thing of it doesn't matter whether we think something's going to work or not. It's just the doing anything. So I wrote this poem. This is long ago. This is a much earlier poem, decades old. And I have come to think of it as the mantra against, you know, when you find yourself muttering to yourself, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. This is the poem. So this is on page 113 if you want to read along.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I realized you wished I had done that for the earlier one. This is changing everything. I was walking again in the woods, a yellow light was sifting all I saw. Willfully, with a cold heart, I took a stick, lifted it to the opposite side of the path. There, I said to myself, that's done now, brushing one hand against the other to clean them of the tiny fragments of bark. And behind that poem was the idea, which was then new, now it's, long familiar, of the butterfly effect. And, the butterfly effect is this thing that, came out from science of if a butterfly flaps its wings in Asia, it might create a sandstorm in Africa 7 months later. It's the idea that small changes have huge repercussions, which we cannot know what they are. And so, picking up this stick and moving it to the other side of the path, I don't know what I changed. I don't know what butterfly effect might come from that, but it was what I could do, with a cold heart, willfully. Okay, I'm going to change something.
You
And
altered the course of human history.
yeah, well, it gives the poem its modest title, Changing Everything. Because you change anything, you have
That's
changed
terrific. That's
everything.
terrific.
And yet we haven't talked that much about, science and these poems, but I find more and more that the vocabulary of scientific discovery keeps coming into my poems and alters what I write, how I write it, the actions that I take. And if I can give you one more sort of really, for me, central example of, a
Please.
poem. So this poem, again, sort of like Let Them Not Say, and I think it is, it is the child of Let Them Not Say in many ways. The poem On the Fifth Day, which, if I can find it in here, yeah, page 326. So we will remember that, Let Them Not Say was written the day that Trump was inaugurated. Well, the fifth day of that administration being in place was the day that, again, some of you will remember, the White House had taken down from its website every reference to climate change.
Right.
And on the fifth day was the day that the word came down that any scientist who worked for the EPA or pretty much any research having to do with the environment who was funded by the federal government, they were all told they were forbidden to speak about their research to the public without having it vetted with the administrative head above them. Now, over the last decades, many of my closest friends have become research scientists, geomorphologists, molecular biologists, food web ecologists. And I took this really personally. This was censorship, and I took it personally. It was my friends. So I wrote this poem, sent it to my friends after it was finished, sent it to 3 of them. They sort of emailed back, can we send it to other of our friends? I said, sure. And not very long afterwards, a few months afterwards, I was saying it on the Washington Mall at the first March for Science to 40 or 50,000 people, an experience no poet ever really expects to have in their life. Started an organization started something which I thought was a one-day project, Poets for Science. It was supposed to be a tent at the march for part of the teach-in at the rally beforehand. It is still going to this day. It was on display. It's an interactive installation. It's a website, poetsforscience.org. You can find it. And it just kept going and turned me into a person who actually does something organized, which I never in my life would have imagined either. So here's the poem, On the Fifth Day. On the fifth day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing, factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the fifth day of silence. When I read that on the mall, there happened to be near the front of this enormous crowd, there were a bunch of people associated with bees. They were dressed in bee costumes. They were holding bee signs. And when I got to the bees, no, they all started jumping up and down and shouting. And I almost stopped dead in my tracks. A poet has never been interrupted by shouting, leaping bee people. And, it just totally took me aback. But I somehow managed to keep
Beautiful.
I stepped forward by writing a poem, which I had to do for myself because I was so distressed. And that is what
Yeah.
I do when I am distressed. I do nothing. I write a poem. And then sometimes the poem goes out into the world and turns into something. And then that something turns into something else. And the poem ended up being published full page in the Washington Post.
And affected tens of thousands of people. Yeah.
Well, at least the scientists knew the poets were behind them, an act of solidarity.
Yeah.
They seemed to like that. They were, when they would walk into the mall, and the ones who walked by the Big Poets for Science tent, you could see them do an absolute double take. Poets for Science, what is that? And we
Right.
had these human-sized banners on the outside of the tent, and they'd come over and start reading, and you could see their faces soften, because that was, there were poems about every discipline. There were poems about the Hubble telescope and poems about MRI machines and, poems about chemistry labs. And they would just sort of look at it and go, I didn't know this was possible. So we try to serve. If we can, we try to be of service.
Well, we appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
So we have, going back to our structure, and I don't want us to hurry, but there are two more categories, and I have one poem in each one.
Okay.
And Jane and I had talked about a category called fail or failure or failing, which I puzzled over a bit. And my first note when I was looking for poems was these are hard to find. I can't find it. And then I found three. But I'll just name one of these, and I think I mentioned it to you before. The egg had frozen, an accident. I thought of my life.
Okay, remind me the page number, please.
It's 248.
248, okay. Yeah, I was stunned and then I thought for a second, I went, oh, that's pretty good. It's also one of the very few poems, I'm usually so serious. This poem's a little less. Okay, so I was staying somewhere. They needed someone to put the chickens in at night after, before dark. Where I was staying, I had a stove, I had a refrigerator, and I thought, I've never eaten a fresh egg in my life. I'm going to take one of these eggs and, and see what a fresh egg tastes like from a chicken whose name I know. Well, it turned out the refrigerator was running a bit cold, which I had not known. So that led to this poem. The egg had frozen, an accident. I thought of my life. The egg had frozen, an accident. I thought of my life. I heated the butter anyhow. The shell peeled easily. Inside, it looked both translucent and boiled. I moved it around in the pan. It melted, the whites first clearing to liquid, then turning solid and white again, like good laundry.
Hmm.
The yolk kept its yolk shape. Not fried, not scrambled. In the end, it was cooked. With pepper and salt, I ate it. My life that resembled it ate it. It tasted like any other wrecked thing, eggish and tender, a banquet.
A perfect poach. Yes, lovely. Yeah,
Thank you.
failing. And then our last category, I want to try to leave a few minutes for people to comment or ask questions. Our last category was listen or listening. Listen. And what I picked, and again, I hope this is good. All evening, each time I started to say it,
Oh,
163.
wow. This is why I love letting other people choose what I read, is because there's nothing in this book I don't believe in. It's a new and selected poems. I only selected poems that still have, meaning for me, and had to leave out some poems that had meaning for me, because even though it's a very big book, it couldn't be endless. Okay. This was a conversation. It's a dinner party. Again, giving you the gossip. In Port Townsend, Washington, where I was teaching at a writers' conference, and the founder of Copper Canyon Press, Sam Hamill, lived there, had a party, not least because Denise Levertov was there, the great English poet and the great poet of engaged action. And we'd never met, and she wanted to meet me. So it was a very lively dinner, it was a table of writers. Everybody had a lot to say. So yeah, all evening, each time I started to say it. All evening, each time I started to say it, something would interrupt. It was not a thought so very large. It could, in fact, have slipped through any window, cracked open a bit for air. Yet each time I started to say it at that table, someone else would speak. The moment would pass. After the 5th time this happened, I began to be amused. Runt of the litter, thought, unable to get to the tit. Then suddenly wanted to lift it up, to feed it an eyedropper's measure of mare's milk, some warmed sugar water, a little colostrum of badger. It suddenly seemed to me the kind of thought, not large, on which a life might turn. There are many such, unheard, unspoken. Their blind eyes open and close, the almost audible valves of their hearts. But all evening, each time I started to say it, something would interrupt. The moment would pass.
But you still heard it.
I heard it, and it was such an interesting experience. We've all been there, you think you have something to say and you just never manage to say it. I heard a lot of other very interesting things that people did say, but we hear those thoughts, and some of them might change a life. And those are, when I'm by myself and I'm not interrupted and I have the time, those are the source seeds of poems. You have some thought, you hear some phrase, you listen. So much for me, writing is not talking. Writing a poem is listening. And the poem says itself from within. I had to be very strict with myself when I entered Zen practice, because if I had ever allowed myself to write a poem on the Zafu, I would never have meditated. And so I really had to never write poems while practicing Zazen, or I would never have practiced Zazen. And this is why it has come to feel to me they are two kinds of listening. There is the listening of meditation, which in Soto Zen is wordless. and there is the listening of writing poems, which comes in language, in words, and in the music and tone and perceptions that precede words, but then enter into them.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. If you've got just a few more minutes, I'd love to see if anyone has a comment or a question. We only have 5, 6, 7 minutes or so, but it would be too bad if somebody had something burning that you wanted to ask or say if we didn't have a chance to do that. So down under reactions, you can raise an electronic hand. There are more people than I can see, so if you'd like to raise your digital hand, I will see that.
Oh, I see one. Donna has a.
Donna, yes, thank you, Donna.
Hi. Well, first of all, I want to say how incredible it has been. I've been reading your poetry for a few years. I first saw you on the Buddhism documentary that was narrated by Richard Gere, which was absolutely, I think, beautifully done. Even as I've watched it again, I just think it's just, and so that was my first discovery of you. So it's delightful to finally be in your presence.
Thank you.
With the 7 words of Buddhism, the very end, pay attention. The thing that first popped in my mind when I heard that was in relation to Carl Jung's idea of synchronicity. Is there any tie-in with that?
A tie-in of what to synchronicity?
The idea of paying attention to
Yeah.
seeing,
Sure.
looking
Okay.
to see where those little synchronicities might exist.
Yes. So the thing in my experience about synchronicity is you don't know it is a synchronicity until it's confirmed. So we listen, we are intuitive, we allow what steps forward to step forward, and then we find out that we have been addressing something that was true or happening simultaneously a moment after the fact. So you never know what synchronicity is until the world confirms it to you. I just did, I'll try to be quick so there's other questions, we can get to them. I just did an evening at one of the local public libraries with the host of Science Friday, Ira Flato. And I read a poem called Mosses, which ends talking about our 4% portion of comprehension of the universe. And he said, further into the conversation, he said, did you know that in fact, on a factual basis, 4% of the universe is about what we can see? That's about what's perceptible, and all the rest of the universe is made up of imperceptible, dark matter, dark energy. Well, I had no idea when I wrote that poem that I was being scientifically accurate. And it's years after I wrote that poem, and suddenly someone who knows that fact, and that feels like a synchronicity to me, that my intuitive number pulled out of thin air turns out to be scientifically accurate to what it was perceiving.
Wonderful, thank you. Anyone else here? We have a couple more minutes.
So someone asked in chat, I saw it sort of go by really briefly, what am I reading these days?
Oh yes, I saw that pop up too, yes.
Yeah, so because I have the world's worst memory, I can't always answer questions like that because I sort of go, oh, what have I been reading? But I got a book mailed to me there's a poet in India who publishes a book of his own poems. He mostly translates, he publishes a book of his own poems once every 25 years or so, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. And I'm reading his new book. That's one thing I'm reading now. And the other thing I'm reading is a Chinese poet who is now in this country for a little while, living here, teaching on Long Island in a college, Wang Jiaxin, and his poems are absolutely wonderful. And if you want to find a sample of them, Aerosmith magazine is a journal that has online 18 of his short poems in which he is engaging with other writers whose lives have brought them into exile or crisis. So people like Brecht and Auden and Mandelstam, Wang, W-A-N-G, and then the first name Jiaxin, J-I-A-X-I-N. So those are two people I am reading with enormous interest and pleasure right now.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. And we're getting close, Jane, and I'm going to take a risk here. I don't know if this is a gift or a way to appreciate you, or if it's presumptuous. I'll take the risk of the latter. My favorite poem in this book, I'd like to read to you with my voice.
Yes, please. Thank you.
To be a person.
Ah, thank you.
To be a person is an untenable proposition. Odd of proportion, upright, unbalanced of body, feeling, and mind. Two predators' eyes face forward, yet seem always to be trying to look back. Unhooved, untaloned fingers seem to grasp mostly grief and pain, to create too often mostly grief and pain. Some take in witnessed suffering pleasure. Some make of witnessed suffering beauty. On the other side, a creature capable of blushing, who chooses to spin until dizzy, likes what is shiny, demands to stay awake even when sleepy, learns what is basic, what acid, what are stomata, nuclei, jokes, which birds are flightless, learns to play four-handed piano, to play, when it is needed, one-handed piano. Hums, feeds strays, says, all together now on three. To be a person may be possible then after all, or the question may be considered still at least open. An unused drawer, a pair of waiting work boots.
Will you read all my poems for me, please? That was magnificent. Thank you.
I love that one because it's so light and it's just so visceral and real. And the waiting work boots, I couldn't look at that and not see what we've been talking about as far as taking action. The work boots are ready for us to put them on and go do something.
Thank you. So the British edition of this book came out from a different publisher just last month, and it has a different cover. And on the cover is Van Gogh's gorgeous painting of old work boots.
Lovely.
So I love my US cover and I love my British cover. I love them both. But that painting is in the Baltimore Museum, and they're just these old work boots. And I figure, most people won't have the foggiest what they're doing on the cover of the book, but you nailed it. It's that line. It's the end of that poem, the waiting work boots.
Yeah, let's put them on. Let's get to work.
Exactly so.
Go put out the fire.
Thank you. What a great pleasure this has been.
Jane, thank you so much. We can't be as appreciative as we would like to be. So it's we could do this for another hour. I could do this the rest of the afternoon. So we so appreciate your time and sharing your. I love what what's behind the poem is the gossip. I really love the gossip. That helps me a lot. So, and thank you all for sticking with us for the hour and a half.